This is Matthew, host of the Superhero Ethics Podcast, and I've got an ethical question for you. If I'm trying to help you not listen to ads, is it ethical for me to do an ad to help you do that? If you go to our website, theethicalpanda.com, and just click on the join button, for $5 a month, $55 a year, you get to hear all of our episodes without ads. Was I ethical in doing this? Let me know. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. We've been talking a bunch about different horror movies and horror genres and the ethical questions they raise. And one that keeps being mentioned as an aside and something we might want to dive into further is the invasion of the Body Snatchers and all the various movies and things that have come out of that original book and movie from the 1950s. Well, today, friends, we're doing exactly that. We're looking at that original book and movie and the many remakes that have been done since then, some that are fairly faithful, some that go pretty far away from it. 4 movies in particular, but also looking at just the way the story has played a role again and again and has become kind of a cultural meme. And really focusing on the question of what is it about the ideas of invasion of the Body Snatchers that brings so much fear, that brings so much concern, and how does that idea change when it's looked at in the different decades and different times that these movies have approached? I'm Matthew, your host. I'm joined as always by Riki Hayashi, my co-host. Riki, let me just start by asking kind of in general, what is, when I say invasion of the Body Snatchers, like what comes to mind for you about what that means and what it's about?
I think of aliens primarily. But it is interesting because I think the way that the franchise has evolved and not even adapted, it's not even a franchise really per se.
Yeah.
But the idea of the body snatcher archetype, I think, has evolved in modern times a little away from aliens themselves to like robots, to AI.
Right.
Because that's a story that we see, I think, more prominently now in the modern era. But we should go back to the aliens because when you say body snatchers, that's what I think of.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And as we'll talk about, I think 2 of the fears that at least I saw a lot when talking to others, heard a lot, is that A, the fear of yourself being replaced, and B, the fear of the people around you being replaced. And then kind of related to that, the kind of gaslighting fear of not knowing if the people around you have been replaced and not knowing and not being believed when you think the people around you have been replaced. And what was your experience before we started talking about this? You had seen some of these movies already, right?
Yeah. So before we started talking about it, I think like the term pod person,
Yep,
I think is the one I prominently think of. And yeah, the idea of being replaced, because there's kind of 2 ways this goes. One is straight replacement of like you yourself die, but then there's a pod person replica of you that remains. And so that type of story speaks more to the people, the humans who remain and how they deal with it. But then there's also versions of this story where the individual, the human, is not replaced by a pod person, but has a change, a physiological change themselves. So their personality is replaced, so to speak.
Right.
And they become a part of the hive mind.
Right.
And
yeah, and
that...
I think the loss of individuality and the individuality being subsumed to a, this is better, this is peaceful, this is good for everybody kind of idea is very much a part of it.
And that story starts to take on more of what it means for humanity.
Right.
Like, is the question it asks is it better for humanity if we're just drones in the hive?
Right. And I will say, for me, part of why I was so fascinated by these stories, because I had never watched a minute of any of the movies, and I'd never read a book about it. Never read the book. I didn't even know there was a book that kind of started all this in the 50s. For me, when I heard the name Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 2 things came to mind for me. Well, I guess 3. One was kind of what you're saying, just the idea of like being replaced. Second was that I had very often heard this movie referred to as kind of the pinnacle example or one of the great examples of science fiction or horror specifically as political commentary. And so that's how I'd heard it talked about a lot of the time. And then some interesting comments of like numerous different sides saying, oh, this movie is commentary on our side. And we'll definitely get to that. And then third, for me, there's something about this title that like I have this image of teenagers and young people in the 50s going to drive-in movies and watching horror films, in part because then you get scared and you get to cuddle up with each other. And like that's just this sort of I think it comes from like watching movies about people in the 50s or just reading about it and stuff like that. No idea how accurate that is. But to me, that's exactly the image that this movie brings up, is that kind of theater that was often seen as kind of fairly lowbrow or not regarded, and like not the kind of thing you would talk about at the Oscars, not the thing as like serious cinema. This is not film. This is just movies for teenagers and young people.
Sure. I mean, I think the 50s, there was also a prominent strain of like the monster movies.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Of course, Gojira, Godzilla is from
Yep.
the 50s. And in the US, you have movies like Them, the giant ants.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was also a giant spider movie,
Yep.
stuff like that going on.
Yep. Yeah. And in many ways, as we've talked about, that idea of horror as more lowbrow, more, not where serious ideas are discussed is one that is still with us today in a lot of ways. Let me give, just for those of you who don't know anything about these movies or who have only seen one or two, I'm going to try and give just a very brief summary of the core ideas and then the different versions of the story. Because most of them start with, we get introduced to our main characters who come to realize that the people around them are becoming different. And in a couple of the movies, it's that other people are coming to them and saying, hey, I know this sounds strange, but I feel like my husband isn't my husband anymore, and my wife isn't my wife, or whatever it is. Those things come to happen, and then over the course of the movie, they come to realize that this isn't a joke, that it isn't a prank, that it isn't some mass psychosis, as is directly assumed in a couple of the movies, but is actually really happening in a real way. And then the movie will become, to some extent, an attempt to both learn more about this while also escaping it and not letting it happen to yourself, and an attempt to alert others to help stop this. And sometimes that's the authorities. Sometimes it is a recognition that the authorities have themselves been taken over. How much you do or don't trust the authorities is something that changes a lot as these movies go on, both in terms of the movie itself, but also like there's a much higher level of trust of the authorities in the 50s version versus the 70s or the more recent. And also some other recurring motifs, including the idea that you can't go to sleep. That, as Riki said, sometimes it is your body is literally destroyed and another body is replacing it. Sometimes it's something that happens within, a DNA change or something, but that the thing will fully take effect once you go to sleep. So you have to stay awake. And of course, that keys into ideas of paranoia and the idea of like, are you being too paranoid? Are you being paranoid enough? Should other people be more paranoid? All sorts of stuff like that. I think those are kind of the main points that we see again and again. I want to go through the different versions in a second. But first, Riki, did I miss any big things in terms of kind of the overall plot? And I'll say, the last thing actually I'll say is that sometimes our heroes kind of win and we get the sense that like humanity is going to be okay. And in at least one of the occasions, we very much don't. And the movie ends with a recognition that even someone who the main character had thought was with her in the struggle is actually now been a pod person themselves. Any other kind of main points that I missed there?
No, I think that's good. Let's get going.
So then let me just give the quick summary of the different versions we get. The first is in 1958, where it starts with a doctor in a small town. Or actually, do you want to go through, should I give a quick overview and then we talk, or do you want to go through each movie individually?
We're starting with okay, so
I was thinking that I would give we wouldn't talk about each movie individually. I would give a summary of them and then we'd talk about some of the main themes.
Yeah, I guess the most important thing maybe is the differences, right? Because we've given the overview, so maybe like the specifics of where it's happening is important.
Yeah. So, okay, so let me kind of give a brief overview of each one of them, and then we can dive in more. So the first one is set in the 1950s. I think for many, this is the one that comes to mind, although I know for others, it's the 70s one that comes to mind. It's set in a small town. It doesn't say it in the movie, but in the book, which is very close to, it is a small suburb outside of San Francisco, but it's very much small town USA. And our protagonist is a doctor, and some of his friends, one of whom is a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist is the one who is most sort of distrustful of it all, and who is the most sort of willing to say, like, oh no, this is just psychosis and things like this. And it's the one that often gets talked about the most in terms of how politicized it was. And there's a lot of, you can get very meta in terms of like, is it a commentary on McCarthyism? Is it the author couldn't talk about what it was because of McCarthyism? Is it because McCarthyism, we just assume everything was a commentary, etc.? The 1970s one is from 1978. It's also called Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This one has a great cast. You have a lot of fun recognizing it. Donald Sutherland is the star. Leonard Nimoy. For a lot of people, we've only ever seen him as Spock, or playing kind of rip-offs of Spock, or singing the Hobbit song. Here he's playing the psychiatrist role, who again is very distrustful of this, and is in a kind of fun commentary of the times. He's a psychiatrist who sells self-help books and is kind of a self-help guru of the kind that was very popular in the 70s. In this one, it is set directly in downtown San Francisco, which was very much kind of the height of the hippies and the 60s in the late at that time. And this movie is set at the end of the 70s when it's considered, and a lot of the characters are kind of aging hippies, and a lot of it's about sort of the end of the hippie movement and stuff like that. This one is very critical of consumerism and materialism, and there's a lot of talk about that. And again, there's a lot of interesting commentary on it that we'll get into in terms of what it's saying about the 60s and the 70s and stuff like that. Now we jump forward to the 90s, and there's a version that's just called Body Snatchers. And this is from 1993, and here it is set on a military base, and now we have, and this is kind of more of a horror discussion than a ethics discussion, but here we get kids involved. And this is about kind of a single mother and her kids, or no, it's not a single mother. Let me take that back. It's about, really the main protagonist is a 17-year-old, but it's also her father is involved and the guy she's interested in. And again, there's this story of, one by one, the people around her are becoming pod people or becoming whatever it is. They're being body snatched. And she's having to both keep herself safe, but also protect her her little brother through all of this. And so a lot of the kind of things that I associate with more modern horror of Final Girl and little kids being protected and stuff like that, and sexuality being a thing, become a part of this one. And then the most recent is 10 years after that, 2003. That one was called Body Snatchers. This one is just called The Invasion. So you kind of put those two together, you get the full movie. I think there may have some questions about like how much do they have to pay for the rights and stuff like that, and that's why it got changed. And this is the one that probably is the furthest away. In this one, as we've referenced, there's no sort of foreign entities. There is definitely a spaceship crashes, and that's the source of the invasion. But it changes your DNA from within. So there's no separate bodies growing. There's no pods. And this one especially, they really push the idea that Rigi was just talking about, that actually maybe the world is better. Not just that you're personally better, you have no fear, no anxiety, no scariness, as the other ones did. But here we start seeing, as the DNA monster takes over, peace breaks out all over the world. And all these war situations, North and South Korea strike a peace deal, and there's a peace deal in the Middle East, and there's all these signs that maybe actually it's better if we're all just, people who are a hive mind and stuff like that. But of course, at the end, we're rescued by the military. And
the horror of peace.
Say again? The horror of peace. Yes, exactly. And I think from there have been numerous, I'm sure there's a Simpsons episode. I'm sure that there's a Futurama episode. Like a lot of those shows that do episodes that reference, often told stories. I'm sure almost all of them have done some version of a Body Snatchers, either serious or satire or something like that. I think I remember there's a Twilight Zone episode that kind of references it. It's a very often told story, but those are, I think, kind of the main versions.
Yeah, and there's like a secondary. It's not even a spin-off. I'm not going to call it a spin-off, but a secondary strain, we'll
Mm,
say, of this genre is there's a movie called Invaders from Mars, which was
okay.
1953, which is interesting because it predates even the novel Body Snatchers.
Right.
It was remade in the 80s, and in that one, people are. I think in this one, it's not that they're replaced, but
Mm-hmm.
they are controlled. It's like the
Right.
the brainworm version. And then kind of like combining both of those ideas was The Faculty, which is probably my favorite
Yeah.
version of the
I saw that
story.
got referenced a lot as they like play on this theme, even if it's not a version of it. Yeah.
And it to me, it's the perfect play on the theme because it is classic like high school. It's Kevin Williamson wrote it,
Mm-hmm.
Robert Rodriguez directed. It's high school students who are afraid that the teachers are being
Right.
replaced by aliens. And it takes all of that idea of paranoia and fear of and mistrust of authority and
Mm-hmm.
puts it in like the perfect high school package. It's
Yeah.
like, yes, we all felt that way.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. And certainly there's no joke of, oh my gosh, why my teacher is so mean today. They must have been replaced or must have been a pod person or something like that. And so let's start with there. Um, why do you think there is this fear that we have that keeps coming up and over and over again, either of ourselves being replaced or of those around us being replaced? Whichever one you want to start with.
Well, it's like I think the idea is there's two main ideas. One is conformity and
Mm-hmm.
individuality,
Right.
right? If you are replaced, all of the pod people act in the self-interest of the collective, even
Right.
if they're not directly linked. I think in most of them are directly like telepathically linked to each
Mm-hmm.
other. So they can communicate that way. And so, like the Borg in Star Trek is
Yeah.
the same idea of like a collective hive that works for the interests of the entire collective, and individuality is gone.
Yeah.
And I think that is for humans, you might say that individuality is one of the most important things.
Yeah.
It's what makes us who we are. And so if we lose that, I mean, I can't even imagine what that feels like. And that's what's going on in these stories is like you in the specifically the invasion one, the person remains,
Right.
but their personality has changed. And I think that even though the movie itself misses on a lot of notes, I think that version of this
Mm-hmm.
becomes the most frightening.
Yeah.
Because in the other versions, if you're just replaced, you're dead and you're done. So again,
Right.
like I said, it's about the people who remain and who are trying to fight against being replaced. But the idea of you yourself changing and
Yeah.
going, oh, maybe I do like this hive thing is definitely like a big fear, I would say.
I think that's very true. And I think one of the things I think is most interesting is that in all of the movies, one of the ways that you can tell if you're really paying attention that it is a different person or a different version of the person is their emotional range. That they become a lot more muted in their emotions in terms of they're not as super excited about things, but also therefore not as super bummed about things, and that they're just kind of okay with everything. And I think there's always a sense of the monsters in these movies are metaphors that are like, the fears of our own world taken to great extremes. And I don't think it's coincidental that so often in these movies, especially in the earlier ones, the kind of people who are presented not as villains, but as somewhat antagonists because they're the ones least likely to go along with it are psychiatrists and are self-help experts or things like that.
Mm,
Because I think for a lot of people, there's that fear of both because of medication. And to be honest, for a lot of times this was true. And it's gotten a lot better, to be very clear. But, the thoughts of like, being lobotomized or of going on the kind of pretty bad medications they had for a lot of the 20th century that would kind of, make people very muted in their emotions and like not zombified is a term that can be used that I think is an unfortunate exaggeration, but still that was a real fear. of that kind of like mellowing out of everything. And in the I love Leonard Nimoy. I've seen him so much as Spock, and so I'm just so fascinated by him doing anything. And I think having him as the guy who is most known for being a motionless Spock, being this psychotherapist, self-help guru, and all the stuff he talks about in his books that he kept saying is like, yeah, how to accept the world around you, how to stop fighting the world around you. And again, this is very like it because it's very much a rejection of the 60s, you know, we have to be radicals, we have to fight everything. And his books are all about being mellow and just accepting the world and being what it is. And I think this is very much meant to be a kind of foreshadowing of the pod people coming along who are just mellow with everything. And so, yeah, I think that's very right. It's a fear of yourself being replaced either in part, either in full or in part of just having your emotions regulated, of having having to calm down, having to conform, because conformity is a huge part to what other people think is the acceptable range of, excitement or sadness or any of the rest of it.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. One is the idea of hysterics.
Yeah.
Right? The enduring image for me of a body snatcher genre is usually probably at the end of a person just like running out in the streets and being like, they're here, it's too late, like the aliens. I guess sometimes it happens in the middle, like the 1978 one does an interesting thing because they have Kevin McCarthy, the protagonist from the 50s one, be that kind of paranoid character like in the middle of the film just yelling.
So there's a way to look at it as like it's a sequel or it's the same universe or something like that. It's a cool, and again, that kind of like deep digging is not what was going on at that time, but it's definitely a fun connection of.
2007 does it too. They have Veronica Cartwright from the 1978 one. She's like a patient. Yeah. And she's like, my husband has been replaced. But that to me, like, because you look at a character or a person doing that, like yelling in the street, and you're like, well, that's not right. And so as in reality, we would be skeptical or just like mistrusting of someone doing that. And then to cast that in the movie as the correct person, like the person who knows what's going on and is right and is trying to save everyone. But you look at it, so in the lens of the movie, you're like, why don't they listen to him? And you're like, well, wait, why we would never listen to this person just ranting in the streets.
Yeah, no, I think it's very true. And I think the word you use, hysterics, there is important because that's a word that, that's a word that has a lot of very sexist and misogynistic history to it in terms of like, if it sounds like it has the same kind of origins of hysterectomy, that's intentional. Hysterics were things that were used to like, that idea was used specifically as a way to kind of ignore the strong emotions of women. Of like, oh, it just must be like, her time of the month or that kind of thing. A woman is hysterical. And, there's a good deal of that sexism in some of the earlier movies where it's like, oh, but now the men are feeling that way too. This is a real problem. But also, I think I think you really cued into it. And again, that's where part of the social commentary comes from, is that at a lot of the times that these movies were being made, especially the first two, and I want to be careful here because I'm going to try and talk in broad terms because the actual debate about what specific political side the movies are taking is much more complicated than people like to say it. But both the 50s and the 70s are times when there's an awful lot of conspiracy theory happening, and an awful lot of people being afraid of crazy conspiracy theories, but also, and especially with the one in the 70s, this is being made a couple years after Watergate and a couple years after a lot of revelations that the CIA was doing all kind of crazy things, but also a whole bunch of other really out there conspiracy theories that hadn't gone anywhere. And so I think it's, a really interesting commentary of like, yeah, sometimes maybe the person ranting about, oh my God, the president actually did break into Watergate, or, oh my God, maybe either way you see the McCarthy hearings and stuff like that can be written off as conspiracy ranting. But the movies are kind of putting like, yeah, as you said, what if sometimes the person who sounds the craziest, who is saying the thing that just cannot fit your worldview, actually is correct?
Yeah. And I don't know. I guess I would say we should ignore those people,
Hmm.
but the movies definitely cast this light of like, well, you should listen to them because they're right, and
Yeah.
the aliens are here.
Yeah.
So I don't know. But the other thing to me that these movies speak to, so there's the conformity aspect
Hmm.
and the people who stand out,
Right.
as I said, are the hysterical street ranters.
Hmm.
But the other aspect is like mistrust is interesting to me
Hmm.
because all of these movies are set in the United States.
Right.
And I think the strain of mistrust of like neighbor or like the
Yeah.
person at the restaurant that you always go to. Like these things, I think, speak to people losing contact with each other
Yeah.
due to urbanization, right? Like
Hmm.
when you lived on a farm, like you knew your neighbors,
Right.
you go into town, you know everyone in town, like that type of like
Yeah.
very small town. And then as you get into rapid urbanization and then suburbanization, you don't know anyone. You
Yeah.
barely talk to anyone around you. So then you like get into this, well, they seem kind of different now, but would
Hmm.
you really know?
Yeah. And that's very much a theme, especially of the first movie and of the book, that the protagonist is a small town doctor who knows pretty much everyone. So when someone comes in and says, I think my uncle is not acting like himself, and we see it in the movie, but the book really goes into detail. He talks about, yeah, well, I'll go check out if you're right that your uncle isn't himself because I know your uncle, and
Hmm.
all the people who come to his office, he's had at least some little connection with. In many ways, the most science fictiony thing about it is the idea of a doctor who gets woken up in the middle of the night and does house calls. But that's a big part of it because that used to be how things worked in small towns. But yeah, I think you're very right. That idea of, and that now we can't trust each other. That now we don't. That things may be hidden in plain sight. I think is a really important theme, and that's where it gets into the idea of it's not that we're replaced; it's that the people around us have been misplaced.
Yeah. And especially like the more modern versions you get into,
Mm-hmm.
they do the very uncanny filming thing of just people in the background staring. Like the maybe they're not extras, but the background actors are just staring at the camera, staring at the main character for no reason, right?
Right.
Like they're even like walking by or driving by when they should be like looking at where they're going, but they're just like constantly staring and their head turns to keep staring at the main character.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that especially like in the modern era is a very, it speaks to our paranoia of other
Yeah.
people, just strangers. And
Yeah.
like I said, even if they're people that you should know, like people in your neighborhood, they're often strangers to you. And you're like,
Mm-hmm.
well, what are you looking at? Right. Like,
Right.
it's that kind of feeling. And
Right.
now, I mean, 2007 was the most recent, so there wasn't even smartphones really. But
Right.
now in this era, like, why are you recording me? Right? Like, I
Right.
think a modern reboot would utilize that, like the social media of it, and the way people talk about how social media changes you or
Mm-hmm.
changes people like, or the way television changes you and gives you that feeling like, well, I thought I knew this person, but now
Yeah.
they seem completely different is like the perfect paranoia, I think, for
Yeah.
any time maybe, but this time in particular, I think we're due. We're due for a new version of this, even though there have been a lot of kind of like different takes
Mm-hmm.
on it.
I think we really are. I think a lot of the people who I spoke to about it, that was one of the first things that came up. And I remember that, like, over the last couple of years, as people talk about, like, oh, I never would have thought that my barber, that my neighbor, that my cousin held these beliefs that I think are so anathema to my own. But now I see on social media or I see what their politics are or something like that. I remember people being like, yeah, it felt like they got body snatched. And when I asked about the movie, one person who wrote back, Mallory Shaw, who's a fan of the podcast, the fear is the knowledge that maybe you don't know a person as well as you think you do. and maybe you wouldn't know if they'd been replaced as a pod person. Because I thought that's because you want to think that like there are certain people in your life who, if all of a sudden they really liked a different kind of food, or all of a sudden they had a different emotional reaction, or they had a totally different set of values or politics, you'd be like, oh my God, I know that person can't be the same. But how big is that net? And that fear of like, maybe this is really the way this other person is, and I never knew it, or maybe you're right, they have been replaced. I think you're right. This would be a perfect time to do another version because we're living through that paranoia all over again.
And if they have been replaced and you have noticed, does it matter?
Yeah.
In some of them, it does, because it is just a full-on alien invasion, and they're looking to conquer the whole planet.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the 2007 one, Invasion, is like so weird to me.
Yeah.
Because there's no sentient alien invasion. It's just kind of like an accident. Like it's an accidental infection that changes people.
Right. Well, and I did some digging into it. And apparently there were some, no one knows too many details about it, or at least maybe if they have, it hasn't really been put out there. But there were a lot of rewrites to it, a lot of studio intervention to change it in different ways. Among other things, there's really kind of it has the happiest ending of any of the versions, in which, among other things, all of the people who had been changed are changed back.
Yes. Okay.
And that apparently was the studio added that late. Like that was not in original versions of the script. So it's a really interesting one where it felt like the phrase that I often saw was a troubled production.
Yeah, and it tries to say stuff about like pharmaceuticals.
Mm-hmm.
Like it touches upon it. Like it's a part of the main character, Nicole Kidman's character.
Right.
Like she prescribes drugs to people, and those drugs change their behavior, right?
Right.
So like there's this parallel, but it never quite like gets there.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, like someone tried to say something and then maybe was told not to, and they had to edit it out or something. Yeah, like you said, troubled.
Well, it's interesting to me because like the original movie, to me it's much more eerie than it is scary. There's almost no jump scares whatsoever. They're being chased, but it's just a sense of like growing inevitability of being captured. There's only like one or two things that I would barely call a fight scene, and even then, all the people are being very gracious in a way. They're like, "No, we just know this is best for you. This is what's going to happen." And in the most recent one, the 2003 one, even there, I think the only time there gets to be more aggression is because her son is immune. And so there becomes this whole idea of like protect the son so that we can have the cure. And at one point, one of the people who's been replaced says, we just want what's best for everyone. And so we kind of have to sacrifice your son because we can't have a cure for this perfect world we want to exist. So yeah, it's very interesting. But certainly by the later movies, you have much more of the horror elements. We get to see much more of the transformation. I think the 70s one and the 93 one especially, we have a lot of like tentacles and tendrils of things that are attacking people and stuff like that. So it's if nothing else, as a student of horror, it's interesting seeing how they change that and how it goes from eerie to scary to gross to whatever it is.
Yeah, the 70s one definitely has that body horror, kind of a similar vibe to The Thing.
Yep.
And even I think in the 2007 one, they try to do something like, because most of them, there's like a thing that covers your face. Like
Right.
that's the replacement procedure.
Yeah. Yeah. In the 1993 one, you see these like tendrils sticking out and like going into orifices and stuff like that. And then there's a real sense of like trying to fight against that.
Uncomfortable. That's all I'll say about that.
I mean, it's very much so. Very much so.
I mean, The Faculty, I think, did the same thing where the alien is basically like trying to put another alien in you through your mouth.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely like the 50s one best, in part because I just didn't have the many uncomfortable moments that I often have with horror.
But what you were saying about the horror of it, I agree with, because something like a Body Snatcher scenario, they may have some cheap jump scares where like
Mm-hmm.
someone is creeping around a corner and then like the person sneaks up behind them.
Right.
But the horror is like that person who snuck up behind them, you don't know if they're friendly or not.
Right.
And then so like the tension keeps building because you're waiting for the reveal while they're
Right.
having like a normal discussion. You're like, are they showing emotion? Right? Because that's the main thing.
Right.
And you're trying to figure out, the characters trying to figure out like, have they been replaced? Or even if you know they've been replaced, trying to perhaps keep up the facade of
Yeah.
pretending that you are one of them.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most interesting dynamics is that I think there's a part of our brains that just quite naturally, and I think I'm certainly trying to fight this myself, but that is there both just in terms of how we see things, but also because of a lot of misogyny and patriarchy and stuff like that, that tells us that if two people are having a discussion and one person is being calm and rational and the other person is agitated and emotional and upset, that we just naturally want to side with the person who's being calm and rational. And even just the words that I used are kind of pejorative in terms of how we think of them. You know, calm is a good word, emotional is or agitated is not. And in all the movies, because part of the effect of being taken over is that you are calmer and you are more rational, or at least by the logic that they're using, and they're all approaching it from like, no, don't you see, this is for the best. While our protagonists are getting really upset and are getting agitated and are, screaming in the streets. It's flipping that natural inclination that I think a lot of us have to believe the calm over the emotional.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think in a alien invasion Body Snatcher scenario, I've never been in one.
Mm-hmm.
I would hope that I would be a little agitated.
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly I have not in that situation, obviously. At least I think I don't. I don't think anyone around me is a pod person. But I think it's I've certainly felt those moments where I was more upset about something than other people around me, and therefore they were discounting me to some extent, and I sort of felt like, what's wrong with you that you're not bothered by this? And this has both been in terms of interfamily dynamics and also larger political dynamics.
Yeah. I'm just like, I don't know. I personally, I tend to be a very calm person.
Mm-hmm.
And there are situations where I recognize that my emotions are becoming elevated, and I try to bring them down,
Right.
because I'm thinking here of like normal life situations, because
Mm-hmm.
you don't really get into too difficult situations. So like customer service, right? Like if your flight is delayed, I think it is pretty important to stay calm and
Mm-hmm.
just like explain the situation to the agent you're talking to, and
Right.
ask them, what they can do for you. The people who yell and scream at the customer service agent, I personally don't like that, and I think it's counterproductive, because A, it's usually not their fault,
Right.
and B, like they are going to do what they can within their means to help you. Like that's their
Right.
job, and you let them do their job. So that's a little tangent. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking of like, what's a situation where a lot of people get agitated, and I'm like, nah, let's not do that.
Well,
Um,
I think it's a double-edged thing, because I think you're right. In a lot of cases, is that I know that for myself, I deal with a lot of chronic pain, and my natural inclination is to try and calmly explain to my doctor, hey, I'm in a lot of pain right now.
mhm.
What I've learned, though, is that unless I perform their idea of what a person in a lot of pain looks like, I often won't get the response I need.
Interesting.
And my understanding is that that's also incredibly gendered. That's because of where I'm coming from, but that a lot of women often feel like they have to really kind of dial it back, because anything is overly emotional is going to be seen as hysterical, and all the kind of language is couched around that. So that's a whole other tangent we can get into. But I certainly also think that it is bound by gender, but also somewhat by culture, and that's I'm guessing that coming from a Japanese American background has a factor in it. I know certainly for myself, what is considered an acceptable amount of being upset by something, but still being within the bounds of acceptable behavior in New York City is radically different than what it is in Minneapolis. You know, in terms of like what I think of as, okay, I'm trying to convey to someone that I'm not happy with the situation, but I am keeping calm and I'm treating you like a reasonable human being in terms of the way I speak to someone else who I'm working with. In New York City, it's one level. In Minneapolis, it's a completely different level of what is considered acceptable or not. And I don't think it's a thing that the movies deal with explicitly, but I think that's an interesting idea of like, how do we judge others in terms of like what we think of as acceptable and what seems like they're not being rational anymore, and so we shouldn't believe them, is somewhat couched in what we are used to from those around us.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Because when you said that about different cultures, I definitely think that being Japanese colors my understanding of it in certain ways. And I was thinking back to when I would interact with, specifically, like I think of Italians, like Italians from Europe and maybe Italian Americans also, but they would often speak much loudly and faster and more, animated with their hands, like it's a very stereotypical thing. But that can project as aggressive, right? But my recognition of their actual amount of aggression, towards me, and when I realized that that's not what was going on, and like this was just their way of being more animated in this discussion, but they were not like attacking me like physically obviously or like ideologically, but they just, even if they disagree, it's like they're disagreeing in an animated way that once I recognize not to read that as like a personal attack on me, it helped my interactions with them.
No, I think it's very true, and I think that pulling it back to the movie conversations, I think the fact that the story starts in a small town and then becomes told in a city and then becomes told on a military base and then kind of to kind of the whole world in the version of it with Nicole Kidman, the most recent one, is very telling in terms of, because we talk about how much these are stories about conformity and the fear of conformity. And, the more that everyone is considered to be the same is where you get a lot more of that conformity. And like, to me, that's why the setting in San Francisco is so interesting, because San Francisco in the 60s and the early 70s, like the way to conform was to be different. Like everybody, was Haight-Ashbury and hippies and all this. And so the idea of sort of creeping back conformity into a world where it would have been so far away from that, I get why it would be so scary in that particular setting, in that particular time. And just to further that, I want to just do a quote from the director, Philip Kaufman. He directed the 78 version. He said that he'd been a fan of the 56 film, which he likened to great radio. But he intentionally he wanted to make a remake of the book, not of the movie. And he thought, this can be a new envisioning that was a variation on a theme. He said on the film's 40th anniversary. The first change he anticipated was filming in color. The second was the location of San Francisco. Because he asked, could it happen in the city I love the most, the city with the most advanced progressive therapies, policies, and so forth? What would happen in a place like this if the pods landed there and that element of poddiness was spread?
Poddiness.
Yeah.
That's a word.
And then there's a German scholar who wrote about the film as saying there's kind of a lamentation for the end of the counterculture of the 60s, and said that, and he was quoting here, Kaufman had described the 60s as a brief moment of time when Americans, quote, woke up from the conforming other-directed life that he views as characteristic of American life. Both the characters of Matthew and Elizabeth, who are the kind of two main protagonists, are ex-hippies who have abandoned their youthful utopian dreams sometime in the 70s and gone to work for the city of San Francisco as health inspectors, becoming part of the system, which kind of foreshadows their replacement by the pod people.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me, because you could make the argument that they have already conformed to one system.
Right.
Of course, like being part of a human society, conformity is very different from an alien one. But I do like that. I do like that parallel between that. And of course, the 93 one taking place on a military base, like all of those people have already conformed to a very rigid system.
Very much so, yeah. Very much so. And that a lot of it's about there's a whole thing about sexuality in horror movies in the 80s and 90s that I want to talk about in a different episode, but I think it's very interesting that, you know, the kind of our main character is this daughter of the health inspector who's come there, and she's in that vein of she's kind of not very rebellious, but she meets the general's daughter who drinks and smokes and frolics with boys, and who kind of starts pulling her into that world. And then there's a military guy who hits on her, but then kind of has to be told, like, hey, she's underage, you shouldn't be doing this. And what I thought was a really very intentional and interesting comment on that, she's always shown as being, like, well dressed and all this kind of things. And when we see her, we see her like the pod of her growing and starting to interact with the world. She's naked and she's displayed, and like the actress was over 18, but her nudity is displayed in what's meant to be a kind of salacious way. And that to me was just such an interesting counterpoint of the character who'd been presented as kind of like, no, she's too young. You shouldn't be hitting on her. You shouldn't be sexualizing her. And now the pod version of her comes along, who is very explicitly sexualized in the few moments we get to see her.
Yeah, that was 93, right? That feels like probably not a reference, but kind of like piggybacking off of Species, which was another alien woman naked thing going on in that time period.
Yep. Obviously, one thing we haven't really talked about, I think in part intentionally, because we don't want to get too much into the details of it because it is so debated, but one of the reasons the movie comes up so much is that it is often pointed to from varying sides as an example of horror as political commentary, especially the one in the 50s. And I have some thoughts on this that I want to kind of share that I think are particularly from an author named Dean Koontz, who's a horror writer who I think had a really interesting perspective that kind of squares the circle a bit. But I want to start for you. What is kind of your take on, or if this is a topic you've heard much about or had explored much yourself, or kind of have a perspective on in terms of where this movie should be seen in terms of horror as political commentary?
Yeah, I mean, when you brought this to me, my reaction was that Body Snatchers, like 50s Body Snatchers, is about a communist invasion.
Right.
And your perspective is pretty much the exact opposite, right?
That was when I started this writing, yeah, and I'll go into kind of how it evolved a bit, but yeah, and certainly an awful lot of people, and I was taught to me as this was very much a commentary on McCarthyism done as horror because this was the one place you could get away with it.
Yeah, so I'm curious for that perspective because I don't know, it's different from mine.
So I'll say a couple of things. I think you can make the argument either way, for sure. I think that one of the paranoias of the time, there were people like McCarthy was saying, like, the people next door to you could be a communist. And so I think that's where I think a lot of the, like, seeing the movie as a commentary on that comes from. And there is some evidence that some of the people involved in the making of the movie had some left-wing leanings and had been or may have been part of the Communist Party at some point in time. I'm going to quote here from a Tempest article called "They're Here Already." The debate has raged for years as to whether the film is a political statement, if so, what the statement is. Supervising producer Walter Minch denied any intended political message, writing, neither Walter Wagner nor Don Siegel, who directed it, nor the author, saw it as anything other than a thriller, pure and simple. Screenwriter Daniel Mainwaring was either a victim of the Hollywood blacklist or a writer who fronted for blacklisted writers. Accounts differ, suggesting he was sympathetic to a lot of left-wing politics. One-time communist Richard Collins made uncredited contributions to the story. Collins was blacklisted, but later named people he suspected were communists, a decision he came to regret. Director Don Siegel commented on the parallels between his film and the McCarthy era in 1980, a long time later, saying the political reference to Senator McCarthy and totalitarianism was unescapable, but I tried not to emphasize it because I feel that motion pictures are primarily to entertain, and I didn't want to preach. So it does seem like there's some leanings of some of the makers of the movie, but not entirely. But the point that I think really hit me the hardest was in the intro to the book that I purchased, because this was like a 50th anniversary publishing. It was written by Dean Koontz, who is a horror writer. I don't know his stuff, but I know his name. Have you read any of his stuff? I think also some horror movies are makes of his books.
Is it horror or more thriller? Is he the M is for Murder guy?
I think that's Philip K. Dick. Let me look up quickly.
No, it's definitely not.
Dean Koontz has written Going Home in the Dark, Intensity, Watchers, Odd Thomas. And some of them have been made into movies. Watchers was made into a movie. Phantoms was made into a movie.
I guess Watchers is horror. I don't know. I wouldn't. Yeah, I think more thriller, which Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I think is more thriller, even though there's a sci-fi element to it.
Well, the point that he makes, though, and that this was really hit me, is that both fascism and communism and a lot of the other strong ideologies of the time, of the 50s, but also, going forward, are all about the death of the individual in favor of the state. Both communism and fascism share that idea. And that was a lot of McCarthyism, that a lot of other things were all about, you should conform, you should be like others, your individual freedom is not what's important. What's important is the power of the state, the power of the government, the power of the country, the power of faith, of God or whatever it is. And to me, that was kind of the thing that really kind of wrapped this up for me, was that it helped me understand why people of very different sides could see it, because I think that at the end, the fear that the movies are based on is a fear that we've seen from numerous political movements from various sides.
So for me, the reason I read it as anti-communist, in the lens of the 50s, is because it's an invasion of the United States by an outside force. Like the aliens are the communists, and they are a hive mind, and they represent conformity, which I think is a way that communism at the time was often presented. And of course, the idea of invasion and repelling the invasion. So that's why I view it that way. And in this version, in the end, the alien invasion is repelled. And the native humans, if we read it as Americans, prevail.
Right. And interestingly enough, in the book, it is the humans themselves who kind of repel it, the humans on screen. In the movie, and something apparently that was added for the studio, it's because they managed to connect to the FBI. And so the movie definitely is a little more on that side than the other. I think what you're saying is a fair reading of it. I think I understand why people see it differently. And I from the little I know, and I think people have done digging on both sides, I think there's a little more evidence that the authors were perhaps a little more critical of McCarthyism. But I think that's why the Dean Koontz comment is so important, because you really could see it both ways. Because I think you're right. The fact that it's people within your own world, within your own town, switching sides, and that they could, they could be something you didn't think they were, that could be quoting McCarthy, or it could be critiquing McCarthy, because it also could be this wait a minute, I thought we were all Americans. I thought we were all supposed to believe in freedom. I thought we were all supposed to, didn't we just fight this war against fascism, against the denial of the individual in favor of the state? So I think it's more than anything, it's fascinating just as a piece of this larger question of how do movies get used in political debates, is that it's one that really can be used on either side, on any side in these regards.
Yeah, the difficulty I have is the literal replacement version. I think the versions where people are altered and then can be changed back is more interesting, and sets the stage for a little more for the paranoia and whether you're right or wrong mattering more within the narrative, right? Because then you are setting up scenarios where you don't want to kill people who you think have been replaced because they haven't been replaced. They've just been altered.
Right.
Whereas in like the classic replacement body snatchers, there's no longer any stakes to that. Like you just kill them because they're aliens.
Well, I think more the stakes is more that
If you're wrong, like,
but you still
obviously
have to trust. Like, I think those stakes are, but you still have to trust somebody. You can't just you try to kill everybody because you assume everyone is wrong.
Yeah. But I think in the alteration version, like, you don't want to kill people, right? Presumably.
Yeah. It's hard because I think I see your point, but also that later version where it is more the DNA change, I think is so just, it's such a worse movie that it's hard to kind of see it as better because I think it doesn't wrestle with those issues in the same way that the earlier ones did.
I think I don't think it's a very good movie. But the idea, like, that's the way it plays out, I think, in a lot more of the modern examples, like, that are not directly body snatchers, but when they borrow this idea, especially for like TV shows, because then, like, if it's a main character that's been altered, you don't want to kill that character. So you have to have that opportunity for the alteration to be reversed. And there's like a lot of versions that play out that way. I think Stargate did a really good one with that, because they already have, Stargate has the thing with the alien, like, parasite that gets put in people and overtakes their mind.
Right. I mean, Star Trek itself deals with that in a way because, as you mentioned, the Borg is kind of their version of body snatchers. And in a couple of different ways, they wrestle with the question of, can someone be saved by the Borg? And, you know, in when Jean-Luc Picard becomes Locutus of Borg, Riker doesn't want to fire at first because he doesn't want to kill, you know, his friend, but he is willing to do so in a way that kind of shocks the rest of the crew, and they're upset by it because it means, you know, perhaps killing Jean-Luc, but because in his mind he sees it as they're the threat. And then the same thing with Seven of Nine and with others. So yeah, I think that's another set of interesting questions that isn't gone into as much.
Well, the original series did one. I think it was called Operation Annihilation, where these pancakes attach themselves to the backs, and like Spock is taken over. And that's something I wanted to mention, is that around this same time, Robert Heinlein wrote a novel called The Puppet Masters, which was like the same idea, except it was the mind control one. Like, it's an alien slug or whatever that attaches itself to people and mind controls them. And I mentioned to you, like, I think this version is like much more explicitly like anti-communist, because it's the characters are like government agents. So that it's less about like neighborhoods and like trusting your neighbors, and more about the full-on invasion and the government response. And then, like, they repel the invasion and even take the fight back to the invaders' planet. I think they're from like a moon of Saturn or something like that.
Okay.
And so yeah, that version is much more like explicitly like, yes, fight them off, destroy the enemy.
Yeah. Well, and to me, actually, it's funny because we were just talking about Star Trek, and of course, I forgot what is, I think, by far the most obvious, which is that in Deep Space Nine and then in later seasons of Picard, we have literal changelings who are literally replacing other people. And that gets to me, actually, something that had been brought up by someone in the Discord, which, by the way, this is part of the True Story FM family of podcasts. You can join our Discord. I'm trying to be a lot more proactive about posting some of the questions we're going to discuss in episodes there. And a user whose username is Audurs, I hope I got that pronounced it right, Audurus, had pointed out that while the body snatchers thing in that phrase comes from the 50s, that there are legends of changelings, and specifically the kind of Irish Celtic myth that a baby has been replaced, or that a small child has been replaced by a changeling, that go back thousands of years, like to the very earliest Celtic folklore that we know. And I thought that was a very interesting idea, that this, and I will say, as a new parent, I very much understand why it comes from, because there are times when my child is just a perfect angel for a week or two, and then a screaming monster that nothing will fix for a day or two. And I imagine that if you went through this for a couple of years, I get why someone would say, oh, it's not the terrible twos, it's my child has been replaced by a little devil child, or, you know, a goblin child, or whatever it is. But I just thought it was very interesting that they were pointing out that, like, this fear of those around us being replaced is a very, very ancient one. And the changeling is the one I know from Irish mythology and Celtic mythology, but I think there are versions of it in all sorts of mythologies all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, you're familiar with the word doppelganger. That's just a German word.
Right. Yeah, that you're
And
replaced in some way by someone that looks exactly like you.
and I think like the ideas of demonic possession also touch upon a similar fear
Right.
that a person is not acting in the way that they normally act. And so, oh, they must have been possessed by the devil.
Right.
You know, not so much the version where they twist their head around and like puke green slime, but just that they're acting differently and perhaps, like, in your opinion, maliciously. It must be
Right.
demonic possession.
Well, and I think it's so interesting. It goes back to what Mallory had written, but also Adores goes on to talk about how, and I think they're just speculating. I don't know if they have a background of this, but that you almost might think that there's an evolutionary aspect of learning to trust others, and that what they write is that there's got to be some sort of evolutionary side effect of being a social species, and that being able to get to know people enough to predict their intentions is to some degree a trait that's selected for, a survival trait. But the flip side of that is that if we survive, because we're able to trust those around us and decide who to put around us based on that we can trust their intentions are good, is that part of why we feel so betrayed when someone cheats on us, when a business partner, stabs us in the back or does something different or just has a different view than what we thought. And then it's easy, and sometimes it's easier to think that's not them. It's not possible that I could have been so wrong about this person. It's actually easier to believe that they've been replaced by someone else rather than think, oh no, my perceptions of them really were that different.
Yeah, and narratives like this one project a very black and white individuality versus conformity, and in a lot of the cases, like the hive conformity. But in reality, like, we have to have some kind of compromise,
Right.
where we do want to, in general, do things for a collective good,
Right.
the society, your town, your neighborhood. But you also want to maintain some individuality, and obviously, like, from a perspective of civil rights, like, you want to protect your rights to do the things that you want to do. So
Right.
there's a balance to things. Like, I do think that the invasion narrative, when it's aliens, just kind of like cleans it up a little too easily to be like, well, as humans, clearly we have to oppose the alien invasion.
Yeah, I
And
guess for me, I just
that's
don't.
why, like,
Yeah.
projecting like human politics onto it doesn't, it's too clean. Like, the alien invasion is too clean to be like, they're bad, we're good.
I guess to me, the alien invasion for me feels just like a narrative gimmick. And so it's easily like, I feel like I can still get the commentary, even though that one part of it doesn't quite line up. But I definitely hear what you're saying.
Yeah, because I don't think there's any versions like of the Body Snatchers where there's any discussion of compromise, right?
Right.
It's purely us versus them,
Right.
which is fine for like this story. But there are definitely like much more nuanced even alien invasion stories.
Right.
Like the Skrulls in Marvel. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe not some versions, but there are versions of the Skrulls where they are shapeshifters, and
Right.
some of them act maliciously by replacing people because they can shapeshift.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like, there are interesting Skrull characters who are trying to achieve a compromise and a peace
Yeah.
between
I
the
think in Star
races.
Trek, there's an awful lot of episodes where some sentient virus or some non-corporeal alien species possesses various members of the crew. But the crew is, I think, especially in Deep Space Nine and in Voyager, they're able to find out that, like, hey, something about their warp engines or something else they were doing is causing harm to this life form that they never realized was there. And although both sides had started from a perspective of we have to wipe out the other, they're able to find a way to find common ground and to move past that, which, you're right, is not in any of these movies.
Yeah, and the one thing you mentioned, the changelings, right? I think there are versions of that story where not just the Federation, but the Alpha Quadrant prevails against the Dominion and then
Right.
chooses to genocide the changeling race because they're too dangerous.
Right.
Leaving these shape-shifting aliens who can just replace any of us and like destabilize our governments is too dangerous. We have to eliminate them all. Is an argument that you could see being made in that world, and like in other narratives, like that happens. But because it's Star Trek, even though it is a war narrative, they choose for reconciliation and use the character of Odo as that bridge.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the better, more powerful narratives to come out of the Dominion War.
Yeah. No, I think it's very true. That's very true. And it's unfortunate that in the Picard show, which I think has its hits and misses, but I think does some really interesting questions, a very similar thing happens with AI. And they wind up, there's a kind of, one of the main adversaries is a group that kind of wants to wipe out all of AI because of their fears of it. And then in a weird kind of like, you create the monster you're afraid of, AIs start to fight back against that and become the main antagonist. And I think some of that story is kind of sloppily handled, unfortunately, but it again raises some interesting issues of like, because we are afraid of the extremes you could go to, then we have to wipe all of you out.
Yeah.
And you can see that on both sides, because as I said, also again, in that most recent version, the perspective of the snatched people is that they can't allow a cure to exist because they have to have complete conformity of everybody.
And I do think that for all of the faults that the 2007 one has, it does start to tell like the most interesting narrative about government. Right? Because I think the first character who is replaced is the director of the CDC.
Right.
And then he abuses that position. And then like that brings up all these ideas of mistrusting government, mistrusting the CDC, Center for Disease Control, which is, I think it's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate that it tells the narrative in that way and sows that distrust. We can argue about like whether those kinds of narratives have sown like true distrust in institutions, and we should be skeptical, I think.
Yeah.
And always be mindful and seek to curb. I don't know how I want to say this. You tell me what you think.
I mean, I think you're right. I think it's in many ways why I think the 70s version is so fascinating, because I think it's hard for us to imagine. And granted, I'm not one of these people, so I'm putting myself in the shoes of others. But there was a point in time where I got very fascinated by Watergate and read a lot of interviews and also discussed with a lot of like the elders in my family, like what it was like to live through that. And I think a lot of people point to, like today we are just in general fairly cynical about government and politicians, and it varies, but I think there's a general level of cynicism. And what I heard from a lot of people then was that like it's hard to imagine just how much trust there was. Like you can trust the government, you can trust the institutions. You might disagree with them, but they're fundamentally good. And that we think of it as just Watergate, but that connected to Watergate was also the church hearings, which were senatorial hearings that like revealed just how much shenanigans the CIA had been doing. All the stuff we think of now in terms of overturning other governments and doing terrible things in other countries that people just hadn't really known about then. And so for me, that version made in 78 was very much about that kind of question of, okay, now that you found that you should be scared, how much paranoia is too much paranoia? Because the other thing was that in the 70s, therefore, it did become everything's a conspiracy. Everyone's always out to get us. And I feel like the movie is really wrestling with that question of when you felt like there were some bedrock principles that you could rely on, and it was dangerous to do that, and you have to be careful, but what do you do now? Because actually not having any bedrock things you can trust sucks just as bad. And who can you trust? Is it people, or is it institutions, or whatever it is? So I feel like, it to me, I think kind of watching all four of these movies in quick succession, what really showed me was they're all about questioning what you can trust and who you can trust. And to some extent, what the movies tell you is what were the things that they did trust at each of those different times, and what were the areas where they were questioning whether they should trust it.
Yeah, that's very well put. And it's difficult because I think what you said about cynicism, we
Mm-hmm.
are much more cynical, and I
Yeah.
think there's a certain degree of cynicism that is warranted,
Right.
unfortunately. Like the fact that we don't trust government is because they have proven on multiple
Mm-hmm.
occasions that they are not worthy of trust on
Right.
things, and that puts us in a difficult position. And I wish the answer were so clean as to say put more trustworthy people in positions of power, but it's
Yeah.
obviously not that simple.
Right.
It's just unfortunate that's where we are.
Yeah. No, that's very true. Well, this has been a great discussion, and I'll say I originally envisioned this as a very different discussion, and Ricky, you really kind of pushed me to approach it in a different way, and I really appreciate you doing that. And to our listeners, I hope you appreciated it. I think these are movies we're going to probably revisit in different ways from different angles. But let us know what you think. Would love to hear more of your thoughts on all of this. Thank you so much for listening, though. Ricky, thank you for bringing up this topic. If you want to kind of say one last word, and then we will kind of close out.
Yeah, well, I had mentioned earlier about how kind of the modern interpretation is maybe the reason we haven't gotten another Body Snatchers since
Mm-hmm.
2007 is that the idea of the alien invasion is being replaced with the idea of the mechanical invasion, mechanical
Mm-hmm.
replacement, right?
Right.
Of like sentient robots that look like us and we can't tell them apart, but they also still have like that lack of emotion
Right.
aspect. And I would love to hear, like, if you're still here, I would love to hear from you, the listeners, on what stories you have read or watched that have that aspect of it. Like, for me, the first one that comes to mind is Batman the Animated Series. There was that I think it was called Hardak, probably an acronym
Mm-hmm.
for something. And it replaces prominent people in Gotham with robots that look
Right.
like humans, and then Batman has to fight them and has to figure out like who's been replaced, type of thing.
Yeah.
So it's got that body snatcher paranoia, but
Mm-hmm.
it's machines. So I was thinking about that, and I hadn't had enough time to process like what other stories
Yeah.
utilized that, and maybe that's a follow up we can have because it does become a different kind of story and a different kind of paranoia than the alien version.
I mean, to me, it's interesting because the first, and again, I want us to wrap up, but I'll just say, answer your question because I think it's a fantastic question. The first one that comes to mind for me is the Terminator franchise because
Mm,
they're all about the idea that the robots can take human form. And originally, they are these, Schwarzenegger, completely emotionless, to an American, I guess, tall Austrians who don't show emotions a lot can be human, I promise. But certainly that perspective. But that as the movies go on, the Terminators become more and more able to mimic humans and to mimic human emotions and responses, and that makes them more and more scary. And so, yeah, I think that's another great example of what you're talking about there.
and that franchise, it's a little different because like for me, like Skynet just destroys the world. But
Right.
from the perspective of the body snatcher replacement, the kind of bad for movie Terminator Genesis
Mm-hmm.
does have John Connor, I think, be taken over like by like kind of
Yeah.
the nanobots. I think like that's the body of John Connor that's been taken over by Skynet in that version.
I mean, I think you're right. And I think, to me, if you're going to tell a very modern version of it, I think what you do is start with the AI girlfriends that are out there, the AI therapists, hey, are you lonely and sad? Here, you can talk to this AI person who will act like a
Mhm.
girlfriend for you and talk to you about your day and be sympathetic to you and also send you sexy pictures of herself that are all digitally generated and stuff like that. And that's becoming a thing. AI is replacing creative work and AI is replacing so many of these different human functions. So yeah, no, this could be great set of stories.
Yeah. So I think if we're gonna follow up on this topic, maybe that's where we go.
Yeah.
And if you're listening, please write us in with your favorite version of, I mean, the other one too, the alien body snatcher. Tell us like what stories we missed.
Yeah,
But
definitely. Definitely. All right. Well, thank you, Ricky, so much. Thank you to our listeners. We have spoken.